just all sorts of angles on that, including the technical side of hydraulic fracturing. We are encouraging more green chemistry and water use. I think the environmental advocacy groups are doing a lot of that. They're putting a lot of pressure on these oil and gas companies to provide more disclosure about what chemicals are being used in these hydraulic fracturing. The company up north has decided that they've told their production or their completion supplier, that's it, their completion company, service company, thank you, service company, that if you can't disclose what chemicals going into that hydraulic fracture, don't use it because we don't want the headache. So I attribute that to pressure that's been put on by environmental advocacy groups. The final point a couple points I will leave you with is that the DEQ Office of Oil, Gas, and Minerals continually evaluates our program. We're following these studies. We're following studies that have to do with microseismic, that have to do with all sorts and manners of the hydraulic fracturing issue around the country, and evaluating those against our program. We have to continually say, you know, do we have this covered? Do we have that covered? Do we feel confident? And meanwhile, we have these 25 geologists that are out around the state reviewing these. This is one of our geologists down in Jackson that I followed around for a day. She's in the doghouse of the drill rig. Again, I told you that we can't be out there all the time while they're drilling these wells. These are 24/7 operations. She's stopping out there maybe 2-3 times a week. She's poring over their records, making sure the drilling rates match up with cement times, make sure there's not shenanigans going on. She's talking to all the different personnel on the site to make sure their stories are matching up. And you know, I guess that's one of the points that I want to leave you with, is that there's a lot of information out there around hydraulic fracturing and oil and gas right now, and there's many that would paint the sky as falling. And from where we sit at the DEQ and the Office of Oil, Gas, and Minerals, we feel like we've been regulating this for 60 years. We feel like there's some new things on the horizon, and we've adjusted to handle it, and that we don't see the sky as falling. So that's sort of the message that I had for you today, and I think we're going to move to a question and answer period.
Okay, so a lot of yellow cards coming in. We have a couple of additional staff from the oil and gas office to answer these questions. They're going to try and group some of them together if they're very similar questions. So if you don't hear your exact wording of your question, hopefully it was already answered. So we have until 8:30 to do this because we want to leave half an hour for direct discussions, and we have to be out of here by 9 according to the contract with the college. So we're going to try and keep this moving and hope to get to all of your questions. So with that, I'll turn it over. Here's a question that's an easy one for me at least. How do you spell Heidi's last name? My last name is spelled Hollenbach. What's that?
You spell Albert.
Not that one.
I'll take the first question. How much of this gas from a fracking well will stay in Michigan? Because we only have 20% production in Michigan, 100% will stay in Michigan. That's where we're going to send it. If it's right here, it's either going to go to the cogen plant in Midland, or it's going to go to the Calcasta plant that then will go into No, they sell to the closest buyer. So it'll either be DTE or Consumers Power, so they provide that gas, and they're the local utilities. Okay, question.
been so many cuts to state and federal budgets, in the past history of accidents like BP, Enbridge, and Exxon Valdez, what makes you think regulations will be enforced and or accidents will not happen? The regulations are in place to minimize or eliminate accidents from happening. There's no guarantees that nothing bad will happen. Our view on things is if proper regulations are in place, proper oversight is taking place, and that standard operating practices are undertaken, those will all work together to minimize the potential for spills to occur. With that said, there's no guarantees. Things break, people make mistakes, there's no guarantees. I'm sorry, my name is Bill Bishop with the Office of Oil, Gas, and Minerals. I'm the area geologist in the Kalamazoo District. My area is the seven counties in the southwest corner of the state.
Got a question here. In September 2008, the Chronicle detailed how DEQ could no longer do on-site inspections for wetlands permits. How are we to believe regulations are being followed if things were in this condition before the recession? Good question. I can speak for the DEQ, Office of Oil, Gas, and Minerals. The DEQ's been going through funding issues as long as I've been involved with it. The Office of Oil, Gas, and Minerals, let me back up. About 10 years ago, the DEQ had quite a bit of general funding, and that's been converted more to user-based fees where you have restricted funds for each of the DEQ programs, because we could no longer rely on the legislature providing funding for these programs. Now, they have, and some of that funding's been coming back, but the Office of Oil, Gas, and Minerals has an oil and gas fund, an orphan wealth fund. These are restricted funds, and in the case of my programs, the Office of Oil, Gas, and Minerals determines what level of staffing and expenses we're going to need for the ensuing year, and then we also work with Treasury, and we estimate how much oil and gas is going to be produced that year, tracking trends. So it can be a little tricky because we can be off on this, but the fund carries a balance of $7 million, and we charge the oil and gas industry what we think, a modifier, what we think we're going to have to charge them with what we're predicting for oil and gas to fund that program for the year. And then they're assessed that fee. It's called a surveillance fee. It's much like the wetlands program. It's more dynamic than like the wetlands programs and some of these fee-based programs like landfill. They may have a set fee that they're depending on, but if something changes, like retirement costs that the state incurs, like pre-funding retirement, they can't just automatically increase the fee astronomically, say for like a wetlands permit or a landfill permit, but at least in the case of the Office of Oil, Gas, and Minerals, we can charge the industry what we think it's going to take to run the program for the year.
Question, when was the first high-volume hydraulic fracture deep shell well leased in Michigan? I believe that was 2008 is when the company started leasing for that, and it eventually drove in 2010. So there's a couple years lag between when they take leases and do drilling wells.
Earthquakes in Ohio, earthquakes in Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and other places, not in Michigan, can fracking lead to earthquakes. The fracking process, the completion process, I believe there's only one study completed in British Columbia where seismic activity has been associated with the completion process of fracking. The Ohio earthquakes, which were mentioned earlier during the presentation, were caused by the injection of waste fluids. It was not. It could have been fracking fluids that they were disposing of, but it was not the completion process of fracking. Onward, Muskegon County has numerous contaminated sites around the county. Taxpayers are paying the bill for some of these cleanup sites into the state. Oil and chemical companies said, trust us. Why should we trust them this time? Michigan law dictates that if companies who contaminate soil and groundwater are responsible to clean it up. Companies do go bankrupt. That's the law. Companies are responsible if they contaminate the soil and groundwater and clean it up. If they go bankrupt, that's another story. Orphan well program in Michigan has been, over time, we've plugged hundreds of wells that were abandoned by companies that were not plugged properly, that were not plugged at all or plugged properly. Some of these sites, there is remnant contamination associated with that, and we are working with the funds that are provided by that to clean up these contaminated sites. Oil and gas companies put funds into the Orphan Well Fund to keep it solvent, to plug these abandoned wells, and to clean up historic contamination associated with the oil and gas activities.
Got a question here. Has the state Congress or the governor put law behind, and I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher this a little bit, but information or things being pumped into state waters? I think this person's asking what's being done to ensure that that wastewater is not being put into our freshwater resources. This person stated that we have the most fresh water of any state in the union. We have precious water resources. Contamination, and asking sort of what about the Pennsylvania contamination. You guys hear me all right if I get that way quick? The principal way that oil and gas wastewater is disposed of in Michigan is these injection wells. I alluded to 700 injection wells that we have around the state. There's slightly different geology over in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and they don't have the ability to dispose of water like we have. So through necessity, they're recycling nearly 100% of their water. They've had about 6,000 or 7,000 of these long horizontals to our 12 I think, long horizontals. So from the oil and gas side, there's no incentive to back up to a stream while you're getting a sandwich and open a valve and dump it into the water, because they can do it legally. We authorize these wells regularly, and the EPA authorizes them as well. In Ohio and Pennsylvania, they did have instances of this, waste haulers, Wild West, and my understanding from reading what you all read is they've had a hard time keeping track of those. And I don't believe that's going to be an issue here in Michigan. He says it already has been, so we'll go there. I assume he's talking about brine disposal. We had an incident last summer, last spring, in northern Michigan. The state has a process of approving brine for disposal, or brine for use on roads for dust control. The DEQ, DNR at that time in the early 80s had proposed that we do away with using produced water from oil and gas sites as a source for brine, because there is low levels. There's the salt content, obviously, that binds and keeps the dust down, but there's low levels of hydrocarbon involved in it. There's low levels of radiation and other components. The county road commissions immediately challenged the state on that basis, and they won in court. So since 1983, or 83 or 86, not important, but the state has had to have a process of proving produced water or brines that are eligible for disposal or spreading on roads for dust control. The Office of Oil, Gas, and Minerals will review that analytical and either approve it or deny it based on the parameters in that court order. We have another portion of the DEQ and the Water Resources Division, I believe, that actually runs that dust control program. Now, last year, one of the Encana wells in northern Michigan, they had submitted their waste hauler, they had submitted analytical to put the flowback water or produced water from that well. It's been on production for a year, to get that approved for disposal on the roads. That had the appearance of being produced water, not trapped water, based on the chloride content. It met the parameters, and it was approved by our office. It was approved by DEQ, and it was spread on roads. It was immediately brought to our attention after it had been spread on roads in northern Michigan, near a campground, on I believe a lumber yard, gravel. So Encana's waste hauler had that water approved and began spreading it for dust control based on that approval. Controversy revolving around hydraulic fracturing and chemicals that may have been used in that. We immediately put a moratorium on that. We said we weren't going to use flowback water from brine well or from hydraulically fractured wells as dust control. And we didn't say how long we were going to do that, but we certainly wanted to study it and we wanted to get more information. So for the time being, we're not approving that. We're not approving disposal wells that may receive frack water as sources, approved sources for dust control. In response to that, we also went out and tested these roads. We tested the brine that was spread, and it was within criteria. There was no action levels in anything in that water, and no threat to the human health. But for the time being, we're not using hydraulic fracture flowback fluid or produced water from a well that's been hydraulically fractured for the dust control.
Let's see. Michigan Congress insisting that we know what is being pumped into our water system. Why won't the oil tell us what the chemicals are being used? I'm going to interpret this a little bit to infer that they're asking about disclosure of chemicals in fracking fluids. Companies are required to submit to us the material data safety sheets for all of the chemicals that are used within the fracking fluids. There are some proprietary chemicals that companies have developed, spent time and money, that those specific chemicals, there's a material data safety sheet for the product as a whole that will tell what the hazards are for that country. So in case of emergency response actions, the emergency responders will know how to react to emergency situations. But companies are required to submit the chemicals that are in their fracturing fluids with their material data safety sheets.
I didn't understand.
You want a clarification?
So they do not have to disclose proprietary, is that correct?
Correct.
So we don't know.
The MSDS sheets do not contain each individual proprietary chemical that may be in that fluid. That's what I alluded to. The companies are saying if you can't put it in there, don't use it. The safety data sheets, we believe DEQ are adequate for our purposes for responding in emergency personnel responding to an incident. If these chemicals are spilled, you have a semi-truck rollover with chemicals incident. The safety data sheets, as in any industry, provides the information that first responders need to isolate that, shelter in place, to start cleaning it up, to get a handle on how to protect human health.
We verify when this is accurate.
We're gonna answer the questions on the cards.
I don't answer mine.
We don't have a verification process to verify that the safety data sheets that they're supplying for the chemicals is what it is. We don't run analytical on every chemical. I'm going to explain, you've got a question here on how compulsory pooling works. This is a leasing type question, but not a DNR leasing question. What this is the size of a drilling unit varies depending on what formation you're going into, but companies, oil and gas companies, have to put together a unit that conforms with the spacing requirement, whether it's a 40-acre, an 80-acre. And so the oil companies send landmen around knocking on you all's doors, asking you to sign leases. Some people make the decision to not lease. If they hold the majority of the leases in a unit, they can petition the supervisor of wells to compulsory pool people that are holding out on that unit. The reason why they do that is partly to protect the people that didn't sign. That may sound funny to you, but back in the day, the rule of capture was the law of the land, and that's where you ended up with oil and gas derricks every 40, 50 feet on little postage-sized stamps, because the rule of capture directed that if you could capture it, it was yours. Well, that creates waste, because if you don't develop an oil and gas reservoir properly, then you create waste and you damage the formation, and you don't ultimately get as much oil out of that as you could have. So this concept of correlative rights came into play, where states, government agencies could establish spacing to provide for the uniform development of these oil and gas resources. So in this case, where somebody holds out a small parcel in this drilling unit, you're still going to be drained. If they build a unit around you and you don't sign, the oil and gas is movable, so it's still moving to the borehole and you have a right to that. So the hearing goes, and you have the right to file an answer and come, and we do have folks that come to these hearings and respond. If you are put in these drilling units, I would say that the downsides are that you don't get bonus money from the landman, and that you have to participate in the cost of the well at that point. So what that means is you're going to get the royalties and so forth that you would have gotten if you signed that lease. But the fact that you've been compulsory pooled, the company is going to ask that person participate in that well. So the royalties that would start flowing, they don't start flowing until your portion of that well is paid for. So I would say that's the downside of compulsory pooling. I encourage anybody that's being approached by a landman with lease to get talk to an oil and gas attorney, get good advice on leasing.
I'll do this question that's somewhat related. Does horizontal drilling from state land to private parcels require the leasing of the private lands? The answer is not necessarily. If they're going to drill underneath those private lands, yes, they do have to have that unleased or compulsory pooled, as Adam just talked about. So if the well doesn't go underneath that property, then the person doesn't have to lease the land. If the well is going to go under that property and they form a unit and compulsory pool it, then the person can still lease it up to the day the drilling begins. Most of the wells that are being drilled right now are primarily just on state land and are not going into private lands unless they've already been pooled together.
I have a couple questions that are relatively similar, so I'm going to kind of combine the questions. They both ask about water usage, and they're almost more statements than questions about water used and not being kept within the hydrologic cycle, and how that we can afford to do that. You know, the rules are in play. I mean, this is a hard question, you know, to answer. But from a regulatory standpoint, you know, the water usage is regulated so that it will not have adverse effects on surface water bodies. The water withdrawal tool is used and was incorporated into the oil and gas rules when these large water withdrawals were began. The questions are kind of worded as to kind of an opinion on it. It's an issue that the department does not take lightly, and we try to make sure that there are no adverse effects